As you can tell, the freedom of being indie is very much taken control of by our chief marketing officer versus myself. So bear with me on the first couple of slides. But my goal today is to kind of walk through what I've seen over my career in the last 14 years of being at an independent agency, which started at Range Online Media, Aegis, Dentsu Network, and then jumping out to PMG. And some of the things, the tangible things that I noticed with that, I don't think there's going to be anything within this that's going to be like, damn, man, that's really eye-opening. But I think You lost me. There we go. This is an important slide. This has happened to me. I blame it completely on Dentsu and Aegis. I've lost most of my hair over the last 5 or 10 years. It's depressing. I got married, fortunately. I had hair when I got married. But it has changed, and I do blame it, and I do blame the stress. So 14 years, 3 agencies. Again, that was It started at Range Online Media, then it went to iProspect, which was a part of Dentsu Aegis, and then I most recently, over the last 5 years, was back out to PMG. So 2 holding companies, and then within that, working on 62 different brands. These are some of the brands. We'll go into some of the stories because I think these are going to relate well to people in the room. My background is very much in retail and travel. They're a passion point for me. Retail is the most depressing vertical to be in right now, as I'm assuming most of you guys are kind of aware of, especially the retailers. I've got J. Crew on the board right now, which is just like in crazy disrepair, and I can say that because we've worked with them for 5 years. But I'm passionate about fixing that, and I think it's going to take a combination. And the story today is to look, if you're an independent agency, if you're a consultancy, if you're a holding company, how we work together to make this better, but also to identify characteristics of each that we need to start applying to each other's business models. So a quick timeline, it's a little hard to read. I was the 12th employee of Range Online Media. It was started by 2 sisters, Cheryl and Misty, who were the most prolific, this sounds really weird, prolific paid search people that I've ever met. They incorporated on September 11th, 2001 with the money that they had for tax returns. And about a year later, one of the biggest changes in my life was when I came on, I was like, okay, I'm the 12th employee, I'm just running and going. They're giving these 22-year-old somethings just everything to have control over. And in my second year, Cheryl, who was kind of the heart and soul of the business and the one that had started Range and really impacted this search industry, both on the SEO front and for SEM, she had a stroke. That disrupted everything because her sister, Cheryl was in her 40s, her sister was a couple years older than I was then granted the reins of the business, and we had to figure out what we were going to do from an independent standpoint. She decided to keep rocking. So as you can tell, who's aware of, actually I want to do one thing. If you work for an independent agency, raise your hand. If you work for a holding company, raise your hand. If you work for, there was one guy last night that worked for, I think, Deloitte. One of the things that I do want to talk about a little bit later, and it just came out of conversation with everybody bringing up the idea of consultancy, I think the consultants are very good for us because it makes us think differently. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but it is just kind of a different perspective that I want to take. So moving through Range in 2008, we got acquired by iProspect, which at that time was an Aegis media company. Eventually, we shifted over when Dentsu and Aegis merged. It was like merger after merger after merger. And my role progressed from account management, working in retail, to eventually at iProspect, where I was managing director for our largest office in Texas, in a small town called Fort Worth. So we had 175 employees. iProspect at the time now has about 4,000 employees. So I saw the progression of that. I saw the brand change. And I saw what I loved about Range shift pretty quickly. And there was a 4-year period where we had a vesting interest. So Range got acquired, and we had 4 years to figure out when the brand was going to change from Range to iProspect. And I think little things within that started to irk me, and it also started to uncover things that I liked about the holding company world, but that I also liked about being an independent. So my reaction was very gut felt, and hopefully you guys can... Could I go back one slide? This needs to be heard. Is the sound on? Sorry, guys. Bummer. So at the time, this really was kind of the active feeling that I had. I'm sorry about the timing on that. But the reality behind it was when I left iProspect and I left Aegis, because I could do to help better inform a company that was out of my control. Control is a really key element to this, because at an independent where I had full authority as managing director of the business to run the business, I then became managing director within a controlled holding company that eliminated some of that power, whether it was through partners that we chose, through people that we were hiring, through clients that we were accepting. And so it beat me down because my office then became more or less a consultancy within the group, but also I was spending 70% of my time managing a P&L, and I don't have a finance background. So why the hell am I in charge of a P&L with limited training, with the rest of my time being spent on managing everybody's emotional capacity? And they called my office, it was basically of tears, because people would walk in and they would start crying immediately. And so when people walk by, they're like, damn, Price sucks, but people were coming in because our retention rate went from 85% to 50% because employees were, and I had no idea how to fix it because I wasn't equipped to do that. And the holding company wasn't equipped to go and invest in trying to fix it. I'm being really harsh, but trying to get to the point on a lot of this. This is where all agencies are stuck. So it should be are agencies stuck versus agencies are stuck. For independent holding alike, client-side knowledge is increasing. That is one of the biggest challenges for us. That's where consultants are winning, because they're helping educate our brands that we work with on how to ask the right questions, but also how to question their current partners that they've been partners with for 5 years. Instead of us getting defensive, which a lot of times that we do, and I know, with a lot of the clients, we have a 90% retention rate right now, which is kind of good, kind of bad. That's the same on the employee side, is are we keeping a lot of stinkers? Yeah, we probably are. The client-side knowledge is increasing. Transparency, what does that mean to you? Everybody in this room, transparency means something different. I am on the far left when it comes to margin transparency, platform transparency. So when you're working with media and margins are being housed differently within your CPM, everybody knows what I'm talking about. If that is not transparent to the end client, whether that's through invoicing or the agreement, the level of kickback that is happening in most scenarios, then I see that as one of the bigger problems in our industry that we need to continue to open up and talk about to continue to educate folks. Lack of technical or analytical know-how. Everything's departmentalized. One of the things that we're trying to fix, and we're still running into this issue at PMG, is how do we keep from departmentalizing our development team, our social team, our media team, our data and insights, and make that more of a modular pod structure? That's a massive organizational shift. And I think where the holding companies are trying to do that, and Chris is a really good example of this, where Ignition Factory is built. Let's start it out a little bit.
It's just, the mic's messing up a little.
Hello. Much better. So scope creep and expectation management is also another focus, I think, for this group. Is we don't know how to set the tone. We go into a creative brief, or we go into, here's $20 million that P&G is giving us to go activate on a specific brand. And so many times we just get excited about the element that we don't put the scope behind it, or we don't educate the teams that are actually going to be working on it to understand what that scope and that management will come down to. We kill ourselves. I think the healthy debate, somebody had a quote a little bit earlier. So the agencies in this room today will be lucky to be around in 5 years, much less 10, unless they radically transform the way they come to market. I don't know if I completely agree with that. I do think that we, unlike any other industry, have to be changing on a daily basis. And that's the scary thing for us, is that 10 years ago, things changed on a monthly basis. Today, things are changing every 5 minutes. Did you guys see what happened to Amazon this morning? So if you go to Reddit, Everybody should do this right now. If you go to Reddit and search Amazon mass shooting, Amazon forgot to turn off their content matching. So everything that was being related to the shooting that happened, unfortunately, earlier this week, Amazon has been tied into it. And that is a way that can completely disrupt your business. And it's an uneducated way and an automated way. And it also gives us a reason that the people in this room are in here to help educate, but also to suppress and make sure that the mentions and the targeting that we have, there's thought behind it versus machine. Who's read Radical Candor? Ooh, 4. Okay, so this is not going to relate as well. Kim Scott, who is, who's heard of Kim Scott? Okay, less. So she's been an executive coach for CEO of Dropbox, a lot of the Google folks. She led the AdSense product and then started getting into something called the Candor Agreement or Candor Inc. And this is one of the things that I've focused on for the last year or so, where in our industry we have a set of new millennials, and again, I know not everybody likes using that word, but this age group in their early 20s or 30s that are coming in that we're having a hard time managing. And the story itself is, I was stuck in the left ruinous empathy category to where I was overly nice, I was letting the tears just invade my office, which was a good and bad thing, but I wasn't able to advise or lead people forward. And this is where both independents and holding companies, I think, struggle, is that there's a level of leadership in this room alone that sits up here but doesn't advise, doesn't mentor, and doesn't lead. And I'm making a gross statement, so bear with me. The things that I miss mostly about the holding company is a seamless way to scale. We've talked about a lot of this too. As an independent with 150 people, we have offices in London, Austin, LA, and Dallas-Fort Worth. But as I was talking with Sean and Austin in the back a little bit earlier, is we don't have presence in APAC. And how does an agency of our side, where we don't have a network, get in front of people that are in the Chinese market? Versus us just buying media with a regularity and not in any smart fashion. The connectivity and having those networks and just the depth and those 4,000 employees that are localized and on the ground are something that I miss greatly. Brand notoriety, PMG, worst acronym ever. It stands for Performance Media Group, which is also the worst. It was one of the reasons that I came over was to help change that, but our founder is definitely not going to shift. The partner agency, relationships and networks, pitch team, presence, knowledge, 75% of the people. When you ask anybody where they work, most of the time people are like, oh yeah, I stay here because of the people. I was in a fortunate place within Aegis and iProspect where a lot of those people were amazing, but they're lost. The creative prowess and delivery is something else that I miss, is just the bench depth when it comes to creative and thought process. So I go through a career check in my mind, and I'm a loyalist to the bone. Again, I've been at 3 different agencies over the last 4 years. I probably would still be in Aegis and Dentsu if I didn't realize that it was time for me to leave, just because, I didn't have the skill set to adopt or make change. So I think having that career check in mind, but also evaluating the things I do not miss, and this is a longer list. Lack of speed, process paralysis, lack of transparency, smoke and mirrors. My experience, talking to other people as well, I know independent folks in this room that have been at the holding company side and left have run into this a lot. And not all of this is true across every holding company. I'm making a stereotype, but at the same time, these are things that I ran into constantly that all just gave me that irk. And it was part of the reason that I laughed maniacally when I left. The margin obsession, and we'll go into how to address these things in a little bit, but I'm sure there's a list of another 40. And the same can be said from a holding company that's looking at an independent. So perspective. I think the encouragement of change, and the biggest point on here is, this section kind of goes into just around relationships and whether that's partner, whether that's the holding companies that you're working with as an independent, because in so many cases, I would say 50% of the cases, we're working alongside a holding holding company. For Beats by Dre, we've been working with them for 4 years. We've worked with OMD, RGA, Razorfish. Like, everybody's been in there from a creative standpoint, and we've been one consistent arm for it. But the reason for it is because we're filling a gap, and that we can't do what the holding companies can do. So number 3, support our clients in recognizing the distinction between different and risky. Who's getting this right now? The consultancies. They have the idea to come in, and fortunately and unfortunately, McKinsey's working with, like, I don't know, we have 34 brands that we work with. I feel like they're infiltrated half of them. And the McKinsey model is to come in, and this is from a very high level, and to provide a strategic roadmap on what's going to differentiate you guys in 18 months, 4 years, 16 years, and how do we get ahead of it? Activation, 0. And so we have led and partnered with those groups to help identify risk with the consultancies, while also powering the decision making and becoming a partner of the consultancies versus an enemy. Of course, the people. I think acting like an indie, if you're a holding company, acting like an indie is something important. You can look at this just as you would if you were indie. We evaluate constantly as an agency, and I think this is critical for us, is to put side by side the holding companies that are doing it right and the types of companies that they are acquiring. The amount of revenue for acquisition right now is massive, and it's going to continue to be that way. And I think whenever I see, like, Merkle was a huge acquisition last year, or this year, I don't even remember when it was. That was Merkle has done some amazing technical leadership, or they've led with a lot of technical leadership over the last 4 or 5 years, and Aegis Dentsu picked them up as well. And I continue to see these little, well, Merkle's not little, but all these little agencies getting picked up, and then they get diluted. That's my biggest worry. My biggest worry is when, like, DrivePM got picked up by Microsoft 10 years ago. Do you guys remember DrivePM? So they were what I felt like were one of the first. It was one of the first programmatic or retargeting groups that we worked with. Microsoft picked them up, completely diluted it. And Microsoft does that with everybody. But what I would say is just focusing on the choice. The talent is different in an indie, and that means somebody that's more flexible, that can take ownership and empower at all levels. The flexibility, pragmatism, and speed, the thrive to risk, and that risk has to be taken from a coordinator all the way up to the supervisor, all the way up to the CEO. If you're not risking or taking a risk on a daily basis, I mean, that type of independent agency is probably not going to be around in 10 years. But that risk, and I'll have it in a second, it talks about the 10% rule of 10% of your budget or what you do on a given time should be risk or test oriented. Independent, unfiltered, and edited have a massive opinion. And that opinion has to resonate through the ranks. It can't just be that one strategist that comes in and sits on a quarterly basis, which is a holding company, from my standpoint, is where the holding companies do get challenged, is a lot of their thought leaders are coming in and doing the quarterly meeting, and then they don't talk to the brands again for another 12 months. That doesn't work anymore. When you're looking at an independent, if you can separate that and have somebody completely thriving on creating that opinion, but you also have the 22-year-old that has a really strong perspective, and influencing that and mentoring it is incredibly important. So the biggest statement within here is taking that risk and defining the difference before it. The consultancies do an amazing job breaking that down, cost to benefit, or risk to benefit. And I think every conversation during the week in our weekly updates, if you're going over a cost report, or, hey, we delivered 49 million impressions, and this creative performed this way, who cares? Walking through risk and differentiators for how we're testing, independents and holding companies alike need to return that focus to kind of our daily conversation with our brands. So around partnership, the 10% rule. So how often, and a lot of the vendors and partners that are in here right now, decisions will be made, and hey, we ran with you guys for 30 days, you didn't hit our CPA, or your eCPM was coming in at 10% higher than I benchmarked it. Our partners are losing out because we're not communicating really what we need or briefing in what our client expectations are. Or in the long run, bringing our partners in to have that conversation with our clients at the same time. And so one of the things that we've been encouraging to do, and I've seen change, is just making sure that when you go into the scoping process with your clients and you're signing contracts, is to say 10% of this time or 10% of our funding is going to go towards testing and thinking differently and forcing it on paper. The secondary part is creating a feedback loop to your partners and to your vendors so they know what's failing traditionally, they know what's opportunistic, and they're also included on your weekly calls. I've seen some of the greatest team success is when you have a CMO on the client side, and this won't always happen, especially in larger organizations, but if you have a retailer that's succeeding, but they're also entrenched, is that you have a VP or CMO level person from the client side, plus the directorial leadership, plus your agency team, plus your key partners on the phone for a bi-weekly 15-minute update on what that business is, product roadmap, and really breaking down all barriers for communication. Because agencies are the stopgap. We are. Especially when we have junior employees that are working on it and trying to communicate up on what brands and what partners are developing. We become the stopgap. So lean work. I'm only going to touch on 2 on here. The people who created the problem should fix it. How often, I'll take it back to the tiers within the office, is that I put it on me to try to fix the tiers. The case was I didn't know how to empower the employees to go in and advise and lead. And where holding companies and independents struggle right now is the ability to identify a true problem, but also resourcing against it in the right way. So specify how workers should communicate with one another, strive to make tacit knowledge explicit. This comes through training. I think it was on the panel with Starcom earlier, is I think training programs are great, but the biggest challenge is in 2 days from now that training program is obsolete. So how do we as independents and how invest in the right amount of time to continue to evaluate and put the right people into that? I think it needs to be a massive team. I think that's where it's not a chief training officer, but we need leadership within this group to help educate and disseminate all this information that's changing in a way that people can digest. And it's not sitting in a room for 3 hours and listening to somebody talk. It's a 15-minute quick update that allows for constant training. This is a PSA. Stop using these words, please. I use them all the time, but I think maybe this is just a checklist for me to stop using it. The one that I hate the most, EBITDA rich, paradigm shift, open the kimono. I'm not going to go into much more on here. This is just kind of a break slide to get people thinking again. What is a holding company? I pulled this line out because it gives me the chills. A holding company exists for the sole purpose of controlling another company, which might also be a corporation. Ugh. The next 2 slides, and I promise I'll begin to wrap this up, is the holding company challenges and addressing those challenges on the right. So everybody says, what's one of the biggest issues with holding company? It's speed. That's not the case in every moment. One of my colleagues, Sarah, who's here with us, she came from that side of the business, as did I. In a lot of cases, holding companies move faster than independents based on the resources that they have. But I think it's the way that communication flows that can change greatly. And I encourage most of our teams to when I say cut the line, it means figure out how to communicate way ahead of schedule and up front so that you don't have to communicate 4,000 things to your CFO and make the decision and make the risk internally before you make it with the client. Process paralysis, lean work testing, and data-led feedback, everything needs to have data related to it. That can slow down a process. So building the infrastructure internally, which in my past life, we had 30 DBs working on reporting and an output that would take 45 days to get a monthly report. So it's completely obsolete. That has changed, I think. But allowing your teams to have the action first to be able to go and pull these numbers on their own, make decisioning without having to go and work with an insights team to make every decision. Margin obsession. If you're GM, if you are the GM, this is a problem for the CFO. This is the problem for your controller, for your COO. If your focus is primarily margin, which mine was for a time being, that's 70% time that I spent managing a P&L and resourcing, unless I have this massive finance background and I can build out this forecasting, and I'm really great with managing multiple departments. Your focus should become employee and partner focused. With your vendors, with your employee, with your teams. Get away from the margin obsession. It's more of a change in your mental state. The one thing that George said, and George was the founder of PMG when I came over, he's like, the first question was like, hey, I want to manage P&L. He's like, why? And I go, I don't know. I just think that that's what I'm supposed to do at my level. And so he cut that out and goes, no, I'm not going to give you access to it. And so I let in for the next 6 months and had no view into P&L, and I had a complete shift in the way that I looked at the business. I was able to focus. I took 6 weeks and just listened and addressed challenges within our product and our services organization, and it took me out. It made me be creative in a different way versus being profitably creative. Bad clients, the CRO and the sales team should not be making the decision on the clients that we take. Who has a bad client in this room? Everybody should have a bad client. Making this a democracy with the team that's led the pitch, but also the team that's going to be on the business should be making the decision to save that client. Tracking hours, stop tracking hours. If you're an independent agency, tracking hours, don't do it. Transparency, unbundle costs, take ownership. Again, I touched on that a little bit earlier. Inability to build or innovate with technology. Who has, I think one of the biggest suggestions would be to add a technologist to every account team. And that's a big resource cost, but it's also a huge fix and unlock for media buying agencies to be able to go, oh, I've got access to Facebook API instantly, and I did that in 12 hours versus a 3-year build. And I'm not going to get into bonus questions because that's a sore subject, but we can talk about it later. The indie challenges, partner, build, and buy. Potential lack of global presence, partner, build, and buy. Transparency and localize. Pretending that you're in China when you're based out of Fort Worth is a really bad idea. So finding the right partners, asking your clients, and being upfront with your clients when you're going into the pitch. You can't sell that you have feet on the ground in APAC if you've never had feet on the ground in APAC. And it's hard for a 150-person agency. It's hard for a 400-person agency to figure that out if you haven't acquired a company or if you haven't built from within markets like that. And lean on your partners. Lean on your partners to go and help identify office space or the people. Brand notoriety. This was a conversation from earlier. I like being the scrappy agency, and I think it's okay to be the one that nobody knows about you in the industry. Nobody knows PMG. For me, that's badass because it puts a chip on my shoulder. At the same time, I go into the room with no fear, and we're going up against some of the largest holding companies and the same holding companies that are trying to acquire us. So I can go and compete against that and get fire under my belt to just know that the scrappiness is a factor of why I love being independent. People and culture, measure twice, cut once. It hurts more at an independent agency when you hire somebody that is not a good addition to the family. So you need to be able to cut that quickly and identify that and put process internally to identify whether it's through recruiting or whether it's just through your day-to-day conversation with leadership on how to coach out. And so the conclusion, I've got 10 seconds, is to take measured risk. And that comes down to that 10% rule that we're talking about, is like make sure that the conversation with your brands is to focus on spending 10% of your time, 10% of your investment on growth. Blend from within because merging kills independence. I've been a part of that. I've seen it happen over and over again to where really great independent agencies are saturated or acquired, and they're diluted. And they're diluted because They were too small amongst a group of 4,000 people. So blending from within and having the holding company, instead of doing an acqui-hire or buying for revenue, go and start to blend and look at the independents that you want to acquire and start making those changes on culturally or hiring in to do the same. Candor wins business and retains talent is the truth amongst us, and also just the feedback to each other and the transparency to vendors and partners. If we're not giving them feedback on how to get better, we're not going to get better. They're also your biggest referrer. And I think that's where holding companies independents can continue to grow themselves. Thank you.
All right, Price, thank you. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I have a question. It seems like risk was like a big thread of your entire journey, and also getting clients on board to take that risk with you. And I know even from an Ignition Factory perspective, like we're always trying to like get them to dip their toe in the water in something really weird and interesting and may not, always work. So how do you get the clients to take the risk with you as a company and then creatively?
Make it their idea. So I think very quickly, part of the way that we've led in is building the relationships with the C-suite and director team. And this was said earlier too, is skin in the game is really important when it comes to that. And so that 10%, for us it may be a percent agency fee. Instead of doing that, it's a percent on growth. So we know that we're going to take a hit on margin for that 10% of budget unless it's deferred out for growth. And so if somebody has a really good attribution methodology set up, which nobody does right now, how do you feed in the incrementality of that investment and put the value behind it and sell that into the C-suite? But I think it's just the nudging. And we're starting to see the shift because most of our legacy contracts aren't set up that way, but now that we incorporate that in the beginning, they're like, oh, that gives me flexibility as a director or as a CMO to tell my finance team, this 10% was already budgeted against it, so let's go and test it and just try this for the next 6 months.
All right, well, thank you, Price, everybody. All right, we're going to keep this moving along. I know people are getting hungry and anxious to get to the activities.